Hey there everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Bienvenidos, bienvenue, willkommen. And if I could remember it in Russian, I would say it, but I can't. So today's video is going to be primarily shot indoors and on the computer. That's why we're sitting here. And we're going to talk about the top 5 reasons that I believe you should switch from the Nikon D850 to the Nikon Z7 II. And hopefully I will come up with enough reasons to, if maybe not trying to persuade anyone to make the switch, but hopefully they make sense from my perspective at least, or from your perspective. So I did want to start out the video today though to kind of, not so much a shout out to the people, my friends and family back in the States, especially down in Texas, who are suffering so much right now, but more of a just kind of sending thoughts and prayers and a little bit of a, not a mea culpa per se, but kind of I feel a little bad feeling that maybe my last video was a little bit tone deaf in the sense that I'm out there gallivanting around in the snow and enjoying my time in the snow, of course, in the cold. It was -6°C, which is not too bad really here in Canada, but unfortunately did not at the time when I shot that realize how bad the situation was getting there in Texas, and how many people have been suffering. Unfortunately, quite a number of deaths, freezing to death, people in their homes and things like that. And so kind of just wanted to touch on that, send my, like I said, my thoughts and prayers to those guys there. And for those who are without power, I hope you get it back soon. Those who are having to deal with the water situation, I know that a lot of people are having to boil water right now, and hopefully they'll have that resolved within the next couple of days. So obviously Canada is really geared more towards the colder weather, you know, those types of things. Even when we were having all that snow last week, the roads were completely clear. They just know how to handle that, and everyone has the proper gear, clothing, etc. here in Canada. Whereas in Texas, they're not prepared for that, right? So, which is simply the nature of the environment. So, so for those of you who are trying to maybe judge those down in Texas, saying, you know, how come they can't, you know, the weather's not that cold, right, or whatever. They're not designed to handle those types of situations. And from what I understand, this is probably the coldest it's been in decades. So. These poor people who are without power, my heart goes out to you. With that out of the way, so let's kind of get started. I want to get on the computer, and we are going to start with my top 5 reasons for making the switch to the Nikon Z7 II. Okay, let's kind of dig down into the details at the specs level or specifications level. And I don't want to get too bogged down in this, but because we could probably spend an hour just talking about specs. Now, there are probably 150 videos out on YouTube about specs. It seems like that's all anybody ever talks about when they're doing a review for the most part. So I don't want to get too bogged down in it, but let's kind of get into some of the things that I feel like make the Z7 II a better camera than the D850, in my opinion. So let's look at number 1, body comparison here. Now I think this does a fantastic job of comparing the two bodies. Obviously the Z7 II is going to be shorter in width, if you will, so less wide. It's not as tall as the D850, and it is not as deep as the D850. Now, some of those may be advantages for you, some may not, but I think these are pretty big advantages, especially when you're trying to haul it around, travel with, those types of things, right? The other big advantage that I feel like is between the two cameras is this weight advantage that you see here, and this little diagram does a great job of kind of showing that. The D850, the body alone, is about 1,000 grams, or 2.2 pounds, versus the Z7 II, which is about 700 grams or 1.5 pounds. So about 7/10 of a pound or 300 grams difference is a pretty big deal when you're out in the field, lugging it around, traveling with it, those types of things, carrying it around in a bag. It adds up over time, especially if you're holding it. You might say, well, that's not that big a deal, but it will add up. So So the size advantage that you have, obviously, is a big one. One other thing that I would like to point out is the in-body image stabilization is a massive difference between the D850 and the Z7 II. Now, I didn't think it was that big a deal in many regards until I actually switched, and I was shooting at shutter speeds at 1/8 of a second, handheld. 1/8 of a second is really not possible on the D850. I'm sorry, but it's just not. You're not going to get a clean image handheld because it doesn't have the embodied image stabilization. And paired with that, that means that you have to shoot with a lens that has image stabilization built into the lens. Now, one of my favorite lenses was the 85mm 1.4G. That particular lens does not have image stabilization built in. So not only did I not have it in the lens, I didn't have it in the camera body. So whenever I was shooting portraiture work, which I shot almost all of my portraiture work with the 85, I did not have any image stabilization, so I had to shoot at a much higher shutter speed, which limited my creativity, in my opinion. That's just something to kind of keep in mind if you wanted to make that switch. To me, that's a massive advantage. So you have the physical size of the camera, it's lighter, it's smaller, and it has the in-body image stabilization built in. So from a photography perspective, that is huge. One other cool advantage, I think, that is not really talked about very much, and I think if I can find it down here. So it shows the sensor comparison. The sensors are very, very similar, right? Basically the same image resolution for the most part. They both have dual card slots. So if you were thinking that you didn't want to make the switch to the Z7 because it was missing the dual card slots, you now have that, of course, in the Z7 II, which is a pretty big deal. One of the things I thought was pretty cool, everyone always talks about battery life. This is a big deal to me. One of the cool advantages, and most people, like I said, don't really talk about this, is that yes, the battery life is far superior in the D850, but you do have the ability to charge that battery on the Z7 II while it's on. So if you're shooting in the studio, all you have to really do is hook up your camera to an external charge port, to an outlet basically, and it's USB-C capabilities, which I don't believe the D850, I think the D850 was USB-A if I remember correctly. So like I said, I had the D850 for 3 years, but didn't really pay much attention to the port because obviously you can't charge via, you can't just plug it in via USB cable. You have to pull the battery out and put it into a charger, whereas on the Z7 II, you can plug it into an external port, continue to charge while you're shooting in studio if you want, or via an external battery pack, which is a big deal, I think, in my mind. So that limitation of the battery itself kind of falls away. So that's it. Let's move on to the next category. Okay, let's jump into the next category, according to me. And that is mirrorless capabilities. So this one's been beat to death all over the internet. I'm not going to go into too many details. This is super easy to find. Obviously, the difference between a DSLR and a mirrorless camera, there are quite a few. Now, I kind of discounted this, honestly, if I'm being honest. Before I moved to a mirrorless camera only in the Z7 II, I never really thought that the capabilities of a mirrorless camera were really all that big a deal. So I just found this one site here. You can find there's probably 100 out there, I would imagine, but portability obviously is a big one on here. One of the big things that I think in the mirrorless side is silent shooting. So this is pretty big if you're shooting things like non-moving wildlife, written about quite a bit online, is when you're shooting in silent mode and you're panning, trying to follow a bird or something along those lines, you're going to get a little bit of what they call rolling shutter. So that creates kind of some banding in there. And so that's typically not what you would want to do if you're going to shoot wildlife that is going to be moving across the frame, if you will, if you're panning across. So you're not going to want to shoot in silent mode for that. But if you do want to shoot in silent mode, like I said, if you're shooting birds that are sitting on a limb or something along those lines, you can shoot in what I would call almost completely silent. I mean, you literally cannot hear a thing. Now, even when it's not silent, and I'm going to try to do this here, and let's see if it gets picked up on the camera itself. This is what it sounds like when you just shoot a normal photo. Now, I don't know how well that picked that up, but that's still, in my opinion, much quieter than the D850. All right, so Let's talk about silent shooting is a big thing. And that's pretty much you can only get that, like I said, in a mirrorless type of camera, and that is the huge advantage to being able to shoot with in a silent type of environment. If you don't want to scare off any wildlife or any other thing that you might be shooting, that that mirror flipping up and down to expose the sensor there is simply not happening in a mirrorless camera. So I didn't think it was that big a deal before I moved to mirrorless, but I think it's a much bigger deal now. One of the things too that I will point out, this live view here that they're showing on the website, obviously the D850 has a live view. Now, what you cannot get though is by looking on the back of the screen in the D850, you simply do not know what your exposure is essentially, right? So if you're shooting in manual mode, even if you're shooting in aperture priority or shutter priority, you do not know what you're going to get until you actually look at the physical picture that you've taken. Whereas on a mirrorless camera, and this is pointed out hundreds of times, I'm sure, once you take the photo, or before you even take the photo, it is what they call WYSIWYG, meaning what you see is what you get on the back of the camera. So you can change your exposure and know exactly what you're going to get prior to taking the photo. So to me, this is a big advantage. Now, I didn't think so, like I said, before I switched to mirrorless exclusively, but I do think it is a big advantage now because you just simply do not waste nearly as much time. You don't have to use a light meter. Obviously, the D850 had a built-in light meter, so you can use that and know you have a pretty good idea, plus or minus, what your exposure is. But being able to look on the back of the camera and know exactly what you're getting is a big deal. So, and I mentioned it also, another thing, this article probably doesn't show that, is in-body image stabilization. So obviously the Z7 II has 5-axis in-body image stabilization, whereas the D850 has none. So if you're shooting on a lens that has no image stabilization built into the lens, that is a big deal. You cannot shoot in lower light situations easily because once that shutter speed drops down to maybe even a 1/30th of a second, you cannot really handhold that very easily on a D850. Whereas I've already proven this in multiple videos, and I'll put some links up if you'd like to see those, that I've been able to handhold the Z7 II down to 1/8 of a second, and it's just super sharp still. Big advantage. Just simply cannot get that going or on the D850, whereas you have that on the Z7 II. And like I said, any other mirrorless types of capabilities that you can get, the EVF is awesome. Some people don't like the EVF. It's a little digitally looking, a little electronic looking when you're looking through the viewfinder, but one of the cool things that I've found from my workflow is that I don't tend to look through the viewfinder as much because of the fact that I don't have to. I can look on the back of the camera. I know what my exposure is. I have all the other features basically on the back of the camera on the LCD screen. So I do a lot more shooting now simply looking on the back of the camera, whereas before I used to look strictly through the viewfinder. So it's kind of a workflow type thing, which is kind of fascinating to me. So you can only really get that on a mirrorless camera. So let's move on to number 3. This is a pretty obvious one. This is one of the major reasons I made the switch to the Z7 II is video, and you can see this here on the website. Now you would think, just in looking at the specs, if you were just looking at specs, you could say, oh, well, the D850 shoots 4K video up to 30 frames per second, right? Whereas the Z7 II now allows you to shoot at 4K 60. But that's not a massive difference for people who are not wanting to kind of slow your footage down, perhaps. Maybe you don't feel like that's a big difference. But the bigger difference, in my opinion, is the autofocus. The Z7 II autofocus is fantastic. It is really good in video. I've posted quite a few videos already that you can see the autofocus in action on the video side. And I'll put some links up here. You can see several of those videos where I've used the 70-200 f2.8 lens in video in 4K 60, and it's just beautiful. It is so beautiful, and I am so happy with it. Whereas the D850, it will produce nice images in video, but it does not have autofocus capabilities. So if you're a videographer, maybe you don't care about that. You're doing your rack focusing thing and all that stuff. You're shooting primarily manual. But let's be honest, nobody's buying the D850 for the video capabilities. It's just simply not happening. Whereas the Z7 II is a much better hybrid camera. You can simply shoot the beautiful imagery on the still side, and then you have the capabilities on the video side for the autofocus. Now I understand what people are going to bring up. If you're comparing to Canon or some of the, I don't know if any of the Sony ones have it, maybe they do, I don't really care, but the flip out screen, you can't see yourself, so you have to compose the scene if you're going to shoot yourself in a vlog. But let's be honest, most people are not buying the Z7 II for vlogging. Okay, you're not going to spend 4,000 Canadian or 3,000 US for a vlogging camera. You're going to spend a lot less, maybe even less than 1,000, or just shoot on your phone if you're going to do vlogs, or you're simply just shooting yourself. And the cool thing that I've found whenever I'm shooting video is that because it has these new human autofocus capabilities on the video side, that even the Z7 didn't have. Now that's a software thing, so I don't know that that's a huge advantage going from the Z7 to the Z7 II, but it's a huge deal going from the D850 to the Z7 II, because I don't ever worry if I'm in focus. Now, people, feel free to put in the comments if you've ever seen a scenario in any of my recent videos that I've shot on the Z7 II where I was out of focus, and I can't think of a single one. It does a fantastic job on focusing on an individual, on a human, and that's all autofocus capabilities built into the camera. You cannot get that on the D850. So on to number 2. And we are talking about lenses. Now, this did not used to be a big advantage on the Z series of cameras, and I feel like now, and I've mentioned this in several of the other videos, this was probably the primary reason I made the switch to the Z7 II only. The Z mount lenses are fantastic, and I'm showing here kind of Nikon's website. You can see the S line or the Z mount lenses here. And the number of lenses have actually really improved over the last year or so. Now you have this full range of prime lenses. You've got the 20, the 24, the 35, the 50, and there's 2 versions of the 50 now. This 50 1.2 is incredible from what I understand. I'm not a big shooter on a 50mm lens. It's just never been a focal length that I've preferred. But I understand that it is a gorgeous lens, and I've seen many people shooting on that lens compared to any 50mm. Now, I had the 50 1.8. I had 2 of them actually, and I hated those lenses. You know, hopefully I'm not offending anybody by saying that, but most of the images that I shot with a 50 I did not like. So I'm curious. I have not bought the 50 1.8. I don't think I can. You know, let's just take a look at the 1.2 just really quickly. I don't need to be shooting at that, you know, shallow of depth of field, f1.2 for me personally. Now that's more of a professional level lens, let's just be honest, of course. So if you like that focal length, the 1.2 probably is a fantastic lens. Compared to any of the f-mount 50mm lenses, it blows it out of the water from what I've seen. So it's not even close, in my opinion. Now this 50mm 1.8 I hear is a fantastic lens as well. Beautiful lens. Now some of these lenses, they're not real super fancy on the outside, and I've mentioned this before in some of my other videos as well, but they get the job done and they are gorgeous. The capabilities of the lenses are just they're just spectacular, especially the now I'm shooting, or I shot the intro on I shoot most of my intros on the 35mm prime, this one here, the 35 1.8. I have acquired, as I've mentioned in other videos, the 85 1.8, and I plan on doing portraiture work with that. Now I think there is going to be a 1.8, or excuse me, an 85 1.2 coming out, maybe this year, not quite sure. I don't know that I could, now I think it's probably going to be in the thousands of dollars, and I'm not sure I could really justify the cost of that lens, but The 85 from what I've seen so far, and like I said, I've only shot a few images with that, but I plan on using that for portraiture. I think the new Z mount lenses in the 1.8 are the equivalent of the old 1.4 professional lenses, in my opinion, on the prime side. Now, I owned the 70-200 f2.8. Now, it does have vibration compensation or image stabilization built into the lens, so that works in conjunction with the image stabilization already built into the camera. So the images coming out of that lens are fantastic. I am so happy with that lens. It just blows the other one out of the way, or out of the water, I should say. The older f mount 70-200 f2.8 that I owned. I think it's a tad bit lighter, not by much probably, but it is a gorgeous lens. It is so nice. And this is, like I said, the major reason I made the switch to the Z7 II was lenses. And when I say lenses, I mean native lenses. You can still use the old f-mount lenses on the Z7 II, whereas that is a big disadvantage on the D850. You cannot use the newer Z mount lenses on the D850, whereas you can use both on the Z7 II. Big advantage in my opinion. So you don't have to go out and buy new lenses if you don't want to, if you made the switch from the D850 to the Z7 II. But if you would like to take advantage of the fantastic capabilities of the Z mount lenses, then you have that ability when you make that switch to the Z mount. You know, we've got a full range of the zoom lenses now. The Holy Trinity is now available. It didn't used to be available even, I guess, over a year ago. So we now have the 14-24 f2.8. We have the 70-200 2.8. And what I understand, this 24-70 f2.8 is supposed to be one of the best one of the best 24-70 f2.8 lenses on the market, bar none. So it is a beautiful lens from what I understand as well. I have not acquired this lens, but I am looking at it. So I might pick this one up as well, because I am so happy with the 70-200. It is just an amazing lens. And I literally stopped carrying the older 70-200 f2.8 that I had around because I never would use it. The new one I carry around all the time. So it tells you something about how much better the image quality is, in my opinion. Corner to corner, if you're big into corner to corner sharpness, which personally I don't really care that much about, especially if you're shooting portraiture, corner to corner sharpness is not a big deal. But this full suite of native lenses on the Z mount camera, or on the Z7 II I should say, is a big deal. It is a big deal in my opinion. And they've got some of these other ones out here. I personally probably would not be acquiring any of these. I have heard some rumors that the 24-105 f2.8 to f4 is coming, a variable aperture lens. Now that one I might be interested in, because that one would be a lovely walking around travel type of lens, whereas the 24-70 also it's going to be a little bit heavier, but it's going to be a little limited on the longer end of the range, whereas a 24-105 would be one of those lenses probably, especially if it's an f2.8 to f4. Gosh, that would be fantastic. So that's all I've got on the lenses. Big advantage, like I said, you can use, and nobody's using the knock in my opinion, but if you wanted to shoot down at that, razor thin depth of field at f.95, you have that capability. But that lens, from my understanding, is about an $8,000 lens, and so I will not be acquiring that lens. That's way outside of my capabilities. So huge advantage going from the D850 to the Z7 II is all the new native lenses that you have available to you now, and some that are coming out this year, I believe, would be the 85-1.2 probably. That 24-105 f2.8 to f4 variable is, I'm hearing on the rumors. I think there may be one or two others that are out there. Then you've also got the teleconverters that I hear are excellent as well. So if you wanted to convert that 70-200 to a 140-400, that is a big deal as well. So something to keep in mind going into the Z mount series. The lenses are phenomenal, and they're really, in my opinion, relatively reasonably priced. Like this 50-1.8, I think it's around $500 US, if I'm not mistaken. So obviously that's more expensive than the old f-mount lenses, but in my opinion, those 50-1.8s, the old f-mounts, really not stellar. So I would be willing to spend $500 on something on a 50, even though it's not my favorite focal length, considering how good these lenses are. All right, on to number 1. Now this one's, I think, a little difficult to kind of quantify, and so probably why it's something that a lot of people don't really spend enough time on in reviews, in my opinion, and that is the use case. And what I mean by that is every camera that is compared, it seems like to me, in reviews or whatever, they look specifically at specs and then they compare it to another camera with similar type of specs, and they say, well, this camera is better because of the frame rate, you can shoot more frames per second on this camera, or the video is slightly better, or the eye autofocus is slightly better for this camera or that camera. Where I don't see enough time is really spent is on how you are going to use the camera. And there are certain cameras that would lend themselves better in certain situations than others. So in my opinion, the D850 versus a Z series camera. Now this could be for wedding photography specifically. Now I've kind of pulled up this website here, 50 types of photography. There's a bunch of different types of photography, right? People just don't spend enough time focused on the type of photography that camera might be better at than another. Now I'm not saying that the Z7 II would be better than the D850 for wedding photography, because that's not simply the case. But if you wanted to shoot in low light situations and you needed a camera that had in-body image stabilization, you're not going to have that with the D850, whereas you would with the Z7 II. Now, wedding photography specifically, I think the Z6 II would be better. Image resolution is just not needed as high. You don't need those extra pixels really on wedding photography, and so it's going to lend itself, because you're sitting there shooting hundreds of images at a wedding. You really don't need to worry about a massive file size. You're probably not doing a lot of cropping, things like that. Whereas that 45 megapixel sensor really comes into play more in the scenario in which you're going to be doing a lot of cropping and you still want to maintain that resolution. But when it comes to things like the D850, which doesn't have that in-body image stabilization built in, and you're shooting on a lens, like I said, a portrait lens like an 85 on the f-mount lenses that doesn't have image stabilization built into the lens, then you really have to shoot in brighter situations because of the fact that you simply, especially if you're hand holding the camera. Not to mention the fact that you do not have the silent shooting capability. So if you're shooting in the middle of a wedding service, the last thing you want to do is have that freaking mirror flopping up and down in the middle of the wedding service and interrupting the service itself. It simply would not be allowed. So something to keep in mind if you want to shoot in low light situations, or if you want to shoot silently, a Z series type of camera is going to be better than the D850. So I put wedding photography here. I just kind of showed that. War photography, I don't know that would be a big advantage. Travel photography. So if you, again, if you are in scenarios in which you want to shoot in silent type mode, you're traveling, you don't want to interrupt the scene, wherever you happen to be. Now, obviously, if you're shooting people, you got to be real careful about that. And I've tried to be myself when I've traveled to different countries. You don't want to be shooting people without their permission as much as you possibly can. But if you're trying to catch something that's just kind of catch the scene or whatever, you don't need to worry so much about shooting people perhaps, or getting their permission to shoot them. But if it's just for your own personal use, obviously, as well, it's not a big of an issue. But silent photography is a nice thing, but also the size of the camera, which we've already mentioned. It's a big deal for travel photography. You don't want to be lugging around a super heavy camera. The Z7 II camera is just simply going to be a better camera than the D850 for travel. It's just lighter. It's smaller, and you just don't have to worry about physically putting it in your bag. I don't typically worry so much about pulling it out of the bag and taking a quick shot than I would with the D850. I stopped traveling with the D850 once I got my Z6. So anyway, I traded in the Z6 and the D850 to get the Z7 II. The travel photography, it's so nice to be able to carry around a much lighter camera. So travel photography is one, which would be, like I said, a big advantage because of the size of the Z7 II versus D850. So obviously there's all kinds of other types of photography where it might be more advantageous. Street photography is another one. If you want to be less intrusive when you're out shooting out on the street. Similar to type of, to travel photography, a smaller camera is just simply going to be less intrusive, especially if you can shoot in silent mode. Big advantage over the D850 for street photography, and like I said, the weight is going to be a big advantage as well. So one area that I would say that the Z7 II is not advantageous, and I don't know if I've got it here. Here we go. Sports photography. I personally would not suggest picking up the Z7 II if you want to shoot sports. It's not going to have the highest frame rates as some of the other types of cameras out there, the other digital cameras. If your main focus is shooting sports and you need 20 frames per second, the Z7 II is not your camera. It can shoot up to about 8 or 9 frames per second, I think maybe even 10, depends upon the scenario, but I think you lose some autofocus capabilities if you're shooting 10 frames per second, which is kind of pointless. If you don't have that autofocus capability when you're shooting at 10 frames per second, then it kind of drops down from my understanding. So yeah, you're going to want to buy an A9, probably a Sony A9 if you're going to shoot sports. It is simply not designed for sports photography, but you probably wouldn't buy this type of camera for sports anyway, right? Now, and that's not just the Z7 II, but even the Sony A7R IV is really not designed for sports because you have such high image resolution, or even the A7R III. When you're shooting at 45 megapixels, 50 megapixels on up, you're simply not going to want such massive file sizes when you're shooting things like sports. And then you're going to fill up the buffer that much faster if you're shooting with such huge images. Whereas, like the Canon 1DX Mark III, I guess is whatever it's called, the Mark II, the Mark III, those are great cameras for shooting sports because I think the resolution on those cameras is what, 20 megapixels or something like that. So that's going to be a great camera for shooting things that you want to shoot at higher frame rates, higher frames per second, like at 20 frames per second or whatever it happens to be. You're going to want a camera like that. You're not going to want the Z7 II for that. So use case is something that I feel like people need to focus more on in a review. Camera, comparing one camera to another is pointless, in my opinion, because it depends on the use case, right? So there would be no point in comparing the Z7 II to the A9, for example, because it doesn't. They have two different use cases, in my opinion. Same thing for video. Most people the video quality, in my opinion, on the Z7 II is fantastic. You would not pick up a D850 for video. There's no videographer that I know of that is going to pick up or buy the D850 for video. If you're a videographer and that is your primary focus, you're not buying the Z7 II either. You're buying either, let's say, a Sony. I think maybe that A1 is great for video. I'm not sure, but that's a $6,500 camera, is my understanding, US dollars. So I think that new A7S III, I don't know, I get bogged down in all the A's in the Sonys, but the Sony or a Canon, maybe a C300 is going to be your choice of camera if you're a videographer. You're not going to be picking up a hybrid camera if your primary focus is video. Or maybe a Canon R5. Maybe that would be a good one for you if you don't care about the overheating issues and 8K and 4K 120 and all those types of things, right? Just something to keep in mind. Like I said, I have this as number one because I feel like this is something that is the most important thing you can focus on when it comes to buying a camera, whether it's mirrorless or a DSLR. What is your use case for that camera? And in my opinion, in certain use cases, the Z7 II is far superior to the D850. In other use cases, they're either the same, they have the similar capabilities, landscape photography, architectural photography. The D850 is fantastic for any of those types of things. Wildlife photography, the D850 I think is better than the Z7 II, especially in those scenarios where you're trying to pan. You still have some slight blackout issues on the Z7 II if you're trying to shoot birds and those types of things from what I've seen so far, but I haven't had the chance to really try that out, so I can't speak to it, but just something to keep in mind. Focus on the use case. That's all I have, folks. I hope you enjoyed the video. Oh, here we go. Social media photography. That was a big one. I hope everybody enjoyed the video, and I hope everybody has a fantastic rest of the weekend, and we will talk to you soon.